You sit at the table, surrounded by the warmth of family, the smell of roasted turkey, and the comforting hum of conversation. You probably believe this tradition is rooted in a simple, harmonious dinner between benevolent pilgrims and welcoming natives, a historical moment of peace. The data, however, suggests something far more terrifying. The year 1621 was not a pristine beginning. It was the aftermath of an apocalypse. The woods surrounding that famous feast were not filled with singing birds, but with the silence of mass graves and the whispers of entities that demanded blood for survival. But here is what is fascinating. The food on your plate, the corn, the squash, the very concept of the harvest is not just agriculture. It is the result of ancient, dark covenants made with spirits that could just as easily devour a village as feed it. Let me show you how the legends of the land didn't just shape the holiday, they haunted it. You're watching The Myth Weaver, where shadows unravel the truth. To understand the true shape of Thanksgiving, we must first strip away the buckle-hatted caricatures and step into the freezing mud of the 17th century Northeast. The landscape the pilgrims stumbled into was not a virgin wilderness waiting to be tamed. It was a graveyard. In the 3 years prior to the Mayflower's arrival, a mysterious plague had swept through the coastal tribes, liquefying the internal organs of its victims and turning vibrant villages into ghost towns. When the English settlers arrived, they didn't find empty land. They found houses filled with unburied skeletons, bleaching in the cold sea air. The Wampanoag, the people of the first light, were living in a post-apocalyptic reality. Their world had ended. The survivors were traumatized, surrounded by the rotting remnants of their kin, and acutely aware that the spiritual balance of their world had been violently shattered. This is the context the history books sanitize. The first Thanksgiving was not a casual party. It was a desperate, high-stakes political maneuver between a group of religious zealots who believed the devil was hiding behind every tree, and a shattered indigenous nation trying to navigate a landscape that had suddenly turned against them. But the Wampanoag did not just fear the English muskets or the rival Narragansett tribe to the west. They feared the Manitou. They feared the entities that lived in the wind, the water, and the deep frozen earth. In their worldview, survival was not about conquering nature, it was about appeasing it. The harvest was not a guarantee, it was a bargain. And in the folklore of the eastern woodlands, bargains often required a price that went far beyond sweat and labor. The English, for their part, were paralyzed by their own superstitions. They saw the vast, dark forests of the New World as the literal domain of Satan, a howling wilderness where God's light was dim. When they sat down with the Wampanoag, they were two groups of people terrified of the supernatural, eating together in a graveyard, hoping the coming winter wouldn't finish what the plague and the sea had started. This tension, this vibrating fear of the unknown, is the canvas upon which the true legends of Thanksgiving were painted. The stories told around those fires weren't about morality. They were survival manuals disguised as myths. They were warnings about what happens when you disrespect the spirits that govern the grain and the game. Consider the centerpiece of the table, the corn. To the modern mind, corn is a commodity, a side dish, a decoration. To the indigenous peoples of the Northeast, corn was a mother, and her story begins with death. Long before the settlers arrived, the Wampanoag and their neighbors told the legend of the first mother. As the story goes, there was a time when the people were starving. The game had vanished, the rivers ran empty, and the children cried with bellies swollen from hunger. The first mother, seeing her children fading into dust, made a decision that chills the blood even as it saves the life. She told her husband that he must kill her. He refused, horrified, but she insisted. She instructed him to drag her bleeding body across the earth, to strip the flesh from her bones and bury her remains in the soil. She promised that if he did this, If he committed this act of supreme sacrifice, she would return to feed them forever. Weeping, the husband complied. He dragged her broken form across the fields, her blood soaking into the thirsty dirt. And from her brave, 3 plants sprouted: the tall, strong corn, the beans that wrapped around the stalk like a sister's embrace, and the squash that spread low to protect the soil's moisture. These were the 3 sisters. They were not just crops. They were the body of the first mother, resurrected. Every time the people ate, they were consuming the sacrifice of an ancestor. This recontextualizes the entire Thanksgiving feast. When the Wampanoag brought corn to that table in 1621, they weren't just bringing a vegetable. They were bringing the physical manifestation of a martyrdom. They were sharing the flesh of their mythology. This adds a layer of solemnity and Gothic horror to the meal that the Puritans could never have understood. The Puritans saw providence. The Wampanoag saw the cycle of death and rebirth written in blood. This legend of the Corn Mother served as a constant reminder that life feeds on life. The earth does not give freely, it demands a return. This grim reciprocity is the heartbeat of the indigenous folklore that permeated the region. The land was alive, sentient, and often hungry. While the English were busy writing journals about their own piety, the Wampanoag were navigating a spiritual minefield. They knew that if they failed to honor the 3 sisters, if they failed to perform the green corn dance with the correct reverence, the mother would withdraw her gift. The stalks would wither, the beans would rot, and the hunger would return. This fear was palpable. It wasn't abstract. It was the terror of a child looking into the dark woods and knowing something was looking back. But the Corn Mother is just the beginning. The folklore of the region speaks of entities far older and far hungrier than the spirits of agriculture. As the days grew shorter and the frost began to bite, the Wampanoag knew that the season of the harvest was also the season of the monsters. The thinning of the veil between the living and the dead wasn't a Halloween trope. It was a meteorological reality. As the sun retreated, the deep woods woke up. The legends tell of stone giants who crushed forests underfoot, of underwater panthers who drowned the unwary, and of the shapeshifters who walked among men with eyes that reflected no light. The most pervasive fear, however, was not of a monster outside, but of the monster within. In the starving times, in the deep freeze of a New England winter, hunger does strange things to the human mind. It hollows out the morality before it hollows out the body. The Wampanoag and the Algonquian peoples generally held a deep ancestral terror of the Wendigo. The Wendigo, the spirit of greed, of gluttony, of the hunger that can never be sated. While the Wendigo is often associated with the tribes further north and west, the spiritual contagion it represented, the fear of turning to cannibalism, of consuming one's own kin to survive, was a shadow that hung over every winter. The Thanksgiving feast, therefore, stands as a bulwark against this darkness. It was a ritual of abundance designed to keep the hunger and the monsters that hunger invites at bay. By piling the table high, by sharing food even with strangers who carried strange weapons and worshipped a strange god, the Wampanoag were engaging in a ritual of spiritual protection. They were asserting order over chaos. They were saying to the spirits of famine and greed, "We have enough. We are human. We will not eat each other." But what the Pilgrims didn't realize was that their presence had awakened something else. The disruption of the land, the felling of the sacred trees, the ignoring of the ancient boundaries, it was all noticed. The legend suggests that the arrival of the settlers didn't just bring disease, it brought a spiritual disturbance that rippled through the mythology of the continent. The entities that had slept beneath the roots of the great pines were stirring. The Wampanoag shamans, the powwows, could feel the shift. The dreams were getting darker. The omens were bad. There is a specific legend, often whispered but rarely printed in the sanitized textbooks, about the hidden guest at the feast. It is said that among the 90 Wampanoag men who arrived with their leader Massasoit, there were those who were not there to eat, but to watch. They were the keepers of the lore, the ones who knew that a feast shared with those who do not respect the land is a dangerous proposition. They were watching the shadows cast by the firelight, looking for the signs of the Hobomok, an entity often equated with death or the darker side of the divine. The Puritans, in their ignorance, often conflated Hobomok with their Christian devil, but the truth was more complex. Hobomok was the spirit of the night, of the cold, of the necessary destruction that clears the way for new life. He was the shadow of the corn mother. You could not have the harvest without the rot. You could not have the feast without the slaughter. As we peel back the layers of this holiday, we find that the peace of 1621 was held together by the tension of these opposing forces. On one side, the corn mother, offering life through sacrifice. On the other, the dark spirits of the winter, waiting for a moment of weakness. And in the middle, two groups of humans, huddled together for warmth, trying to pretend that the darkness wasn't closing in. But the legends tell us that the darkness is patient. It waits. And as the years went on and the peace fractured, the true nature of the land began to reveal itself. The stories we are about to explore are not just myths. They are the suppressed memories of a continent that remembers exactly what it cost to survive those early years. The turkey on your table is a distraction. The real story is in the bones buried beneath the floorboards of history. To understand why the Wampanoag looked at the horizon with such trepidation during that harvest feast, you have to understand where they were standing. The English called it Plymouth. To the indigenous people, it was Patuxet. And Patuxet was not just a village, it was a graveyard. Just years prior, a plague of apocalyptic proportions had swept through the coastline, turning vibrant communities into silent tombs. When the Pilgrims arrived, they didn't find a pristine wilderness waiting to be tamed. They found cleared fields, stored corn, and unburied skeletons bleaching in the salt air. They were literally building their new world on top of a necropolis. In the Wampanoag worldview, a place of such mass death is not empty, it is heavy. It is crowded with restless spirits who were denied the proper rites of passage, spirits who linger in the mist, confused and hungry. This brings us to the second legend, a figure who loomed large over the banquet table, unseen by the English, but palpably felt by the Wampanoag, the entity known as Hobomok. While the English brought their binary understanding of God and the devil, the Wampanoag lived in a spiritual ecosystem that was far more complex, and Hobomok was the embodiment of that complexity. He was not evil in the Christian sense, but he was dangerous. He was the spirit of the cold night, of the dark water, of the cure that tastes like poison. He was the shadow self of the creator, Kautantuwit. The legends say that Hobomok appeared to men in dreams, often taking the form of a snake, a giant, or sometimes a distorted reflection of the dreamer themselves. He was the patron of the powwows, the medicine men, and spiritual leaders. To heal a sickness, one often had to bargain with the force that caused it. This is a concept that terrified the Puritans. When they saw the Wampanoag performing rituals to appease Hobomok, dancing, chanting, entering trance states to communicate with the dark, the Pilgrims didn't see a nuanced negotiation with the forces of nature. They saw direct worship of Satan. Edward Winslow, one of the Pilgrim leaders, wrote with trembling hands that the indigenous people were accustomed to the service of the devil. Imagine the tension of that 1621 feast. You have the Pilgrims, rigid in their black coats, believing they are breaking bread with demon worshippers, constantly scanning the tree line for signs of the supernatural malice they had read about in their demonology manuals. And across from them, you have the Wampanoag, who know that the land itself is angry. they know that Habamak is watching. They know that the sudden abundance of the harvest is suspicious, a potential trap set by a trickster spirit. In the folklore of the eastern woodlands, a gift is never just a gift. It is a test. If you take too much, if you forget the gratitude, if you ignore the balance, the giver will return to collect a debt that can only be paid in blood. The Wampanoag were not just sharing food to be polite, they were performing a binding ritual. By bringing deer, 5 freshly killed deer, the legends specify, they were offering life to the alliance, but also to the land. The number 5 is significant in many indigenous numerologies, often representing the 4 directions plus the center, or the balance of the human hand. They were trying to stabilize a world that had tipped into chaos due to the plague. They were trying to use the English muskets as a counterbalance against the spiritual darkness that had decimated their people. But Hobomok was not the only thing waiting in the woods. If we venture deeper into the mythology of the region, past the village clearings and into the pine barrens where the sunlight fails to penetrate, we encounter a legend that shaped the daily behavior of the tribes and, by extension, the settlers more than any other. We meet the Pukwudgies. In the modern retelling of Thanksgiving, the woods are just scenery. They are a backdrop of autumn leaves. But in the authentic lore of the Wampanoag and the neighboring Narragansett, the woods were the domain of the Pukwudgies. These are not the whimsical fairies of European folklore. These are 2 to 3 foot tall beings with gray skin, large noses, and fingers that glow with a corpse light. And unlike the ambivalent Hobomok, the Pukwudgies are actively malicious. The legends tell us that the Pukwudgies were once friendly to humans, but they turned against us. They became jealous of the affection the giant creator hero Moushop showed toward the first people. In their envy, they retreated to the swamps and the deep thickets, declaring a silent war on humanity. They are said to be masters of disguise, able to transform into a walking porcupine or a ball of fire to lure travelers off the path. They are the reason you do not whistle in the woods at night. They are the reason you do not follow a voice that sounds like a crying child into the brush. Consider the psychological state of the first Thanksgiving. The English were terrified of the wilderness because they saw it as uncivilized and godless. The Wampanoag were wary of it because they knew it was inhabited. When the Pilgrims ventured out to hunt for fowl to contribute to the feast, they were entering Pukwudgie territory. Every snapped twig, every sudden silence in the bird song, every movement in the peripheral vision was potential contact with these tricksters. There is a chilling account in the oral traditions of a hunter who mocked the Pukwudgies, believing his arrows were superior to their magic. He was found days later, his body unmarked, but his mind completely shattered, unable to speak, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. The Pukwudgies do not always kill the body. Sometimes they steal the person you used to be. They push people off cliffs, blind them with sand, or shoot them with invisible arrows that cause sickness no medicine can cure. So, when Massasoit arrived with 90 men, it wasn't just a diplomatic envoy, it was a show of force. 90 warriors is a war party. Why bring a war party to a dinner? Because in the landscape of 1621, you are always at war. If not with rival tribes like the Narragansett, then with the spirits of the land itself. The Pukwudgies were known to snatch children and solitary wanderers. By gathering in such large numbers, by making noise, by firing guns and feasting, the humans were creating a bubble of light and sound to push back the encroaching dark. The feast was a fortification. This recontextualizes the peace we celebrate. It wasn't a peace born of mutual love. It was a peace born of mutual fear. The Pilgrims were afraid of starvation and attack. The Wampanoag were afraid of the Narragansett and the spiritual vacuum left by the plague. And both were surrounded by a landscape that felt increasingly hostile. The legend suggests that the Pukwudgies were emboldened during this time. The Great Dying had weakened the human population, and in the absence of strong medicine men and healthy warriors to keep the balance, the creatures of the shadow were drawing closer to the firelight. It is said that Moshop, the giant who had long protected the Wampanoag from these creatures, had largely withdrawn from the world by the time the Mayflower landed. Some legends say he left in sorrow after seeing the coming of the white men in a vision. Others say he was simply tired. Without Moshop's protection, the people were vulnerable. The alliance with the Pilgrims, then, was perhaps a desperate attempt to find a new kind of giant, a giant made of iron and gunpowder, to stand between them and the ancient malice of the woods. But there is a darker layer still. In the cosmology of the Northeast tribes, there are entities that feed specifically on greed and consumption. And as the settlers began to take more land, as their hunger for territory outgrew their need for survival, they began to mimic the behavior of one of the most feared monsters in indigenous mythology. We are moving north now, tracing the Algonquian roots that connect these tribes to speak of the hunger that never ends. The hunger that turns a man into a monster. You have likely heard the name, but you have likely sanitized it in your mind. You think of it as a creature of the movies. But the Chenu, or as it is more widely known in the north, the Wendigo, is not a movie monster. It is a specific cultural warning about what happens when you consume without gratitude. And while the Wendigo is often associated with the deep winter of the north, the spirit of the Chenu was very much present in the fears of the New England tribes. It represents the ice heart, the person who has become so cold, so selfish, that they begin to view other people as meat. The Wampanoag watched the Pilgrims carefully. They saw how the English hoarded resources. They saw how they fenced off land that was meant to be shared. They saw a people who seemed driven by an insatiable appetite for more. In the eyes of a culture built on reciprocity and balance, the settlers were displaying the early symptoms of the ice heart. The fear wasn't just that the English would kill them. The fear was that the English were infected with a spiritual sickness that could consume the world. This is the subtext of the Thanksgiving table that no one talks about. The Wampanoag sat down to eat with people who showed all the signs of transforming into monsters. They watched them eat. They watched them pray. And they wondered if the food they offered would satiate the hunger, or if it would only make the strangers stronger. The legend of the Chenu tells us that once the hunger starts, it cannot be stopped by food. It can only be stopped by melting the heart of ice or by destroying the host. As the feast continued for 3 days, the tension between these worldviews must have been suffocating. The English thanking a distant god for his providence in clearing the land of savages to make room for them. The Wampanoag thanking the spirits of the land for sparing them another winter, while keeping a wary eye on the Pukwudgies in the brush and the potential Chenu across the table. It was a collision of mythologies. And in the silence between the toasts, if you listened closely, you could hear the land holding its breath. The spirits were choosing sides. The bones beneath the floorboards were shifting. The real history of this holiday is not written in the treaties signed on paper. It is written in the legends of what happened when the lights went out. Because when the feast ended and the winter truly set in, the alliance would be tested not by politics, but by the very forces of nature they had tried to appease. And among those forces was a legend specifically tied to the harvest itself, a story of a woman who was not a woman, a mother who was not a mother. We spoke of the corn mother, but we did not speak of her sisters, the ones who govern the famine, the ones who come when the corn fails. To understand the stakes of that first winter, we must look at the legend of the famine spirit, a gaunt figure who walks against the wind, whose footsteps kill the grass. She was the guest that neither side invited, but who sat at the head of the table nonetheless. Her presence is subtle at first, a blight on a single stalk, a deer that is too thin to eat, a cough that lingers too long in the lungs of a child. The Wampanoag knew the signs. They knew that the abundance of 1621 was a reprieve, not a promise. The legends say that the famine spirit is jealous of the feast. She hates the sound of chewing. She hates the smell of roasting meat. And when she hears it, she draws closer. First Thanksgiving was, in reality, a desperate shout into the void, a collective attempt to drown out the footsteps of this approaching entity. It was an act of defiance against the inevitable return of the hunger. But, as we will see, the hunger has a memory, and it does not forgive. The transition from the golden light of the harvest to the great death of winter is the domain of our next legend, one that explains why the Wampanoag would never, ever leave food on their plates. Because to waste the gift is to invite the taker. This entity does not knock. It does not bargain. It enters through the gaps in the wigwam, through the smoke hole, through the very pores of the earth that have been stripped bare by the harvest. In the oral traditions of the Wampanoag, there is a distinct and terrifying understanding that the abundance on the table is not a permanent state, but a temporary theft from the underworld. And the guardians of that underworld are not the benevolent spirits of children's stories. They are the Pukwudgies. To understand the true atmospheric pressure of that 1621 feast, you must understand the Pukwudgie. In modern retellings, they have been sanitized into mischievous, fairy-like creatures, almost whimsical in nature. This is a lie. In the deep lore of the Algonquin peoples, the Pukwudgie is a creature of malice, a knee-high humanoid with gray skin that blends into the twilight, fingers that are too long, and a jealousy that burns hotter than any hearth fire. They are the original inhabitants of the forest, the ones who were here before the humans, and they despise us. They despise our height, our noise, and most of all, our gluttony. The legends warn that the Pukwudgie watches the harvest from the tree line. They stand in the shadows of the white pines, counting every ear of corn, every strip of venison. They are the accountants of the wild, and they believe that the humans are taking more than their share. When the Wampanoag sat down to feast with the Pilgrims, they were not just sharing food with new neighbors. They were engaging in a high-stakes ritual of containment. The abundance had to be consumed with absolute respect, because to drop a piece of meat on the ground or to leave a cob half-eaten was to signal to the Pukwudgies that the humans were wasteful, and waste is the invitation they wait for. The Pilgrims, in their heavy wool and rigid theology, had no concept of this invisible war. Their journals from that first winter speak of devils in the woods, of strange lights flickering in the marshes, of unexplainable disappearances. They attributed these phenomena to the Christian Satan, a singular adversary. They did not realize they were surrounded by a legion of ancient, territorial spirits who were testing the perimeter of the settlement. The Wampanoag knew that the Pukwudgies used poison arrows that left no mark, arrows that caused a man to waste away from the inside, turning his lungs to ash and his mind to fog. When a pilgrim died of unknown causes during the harvest season, the settlers prayed for salvation. The Wampanoag likely looked to the woods and knew exactly who had taken offense. This fear of the Pukwudgie adds a layer of suffocating tension to the image of the Thanksgiving table. It reframes the feast not as a celebration of play, but as a desperate consumption of resources before they could be stolen or spoiled by the jealous watchers in the dark. Every bite was an act of defiance. Every song was a sonic barrier meant to keep the gray-skinned ones at bay. But the Pukwudgies are only the guardians of the periphery. The food itself, the very centerpiece of the meal, held a darker, more visceral origin story that the history books have conveniently scrubbed clean. We speak of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, as a charming agricultural metaphor for cooperation. We are taught that they grow together, supporting one another in a symbiotic embrace. This is true biologically, but mythologically, the three sisters are not smiling farm girls. They are born of death. In the oldest variations of the northeastern creation myths, the corn does not simply sprout from the earth. It grows from the grave of a murdered woman. The legend tells of a mother who sacrificed herself to save her starving children, her body dragged across the barren soil, her blood watering the dust. From her buried corpse, the first stalks of corn erupted, her fingers becoming the beans, her torso the squash. This is the first Thanksgiving in its rawest form, a feast of the dead. When the Wampanoag ate the corn, they were consuming the body of the corn mother. It was a sacrament of cannibalism by proxy, a solemn recognition that life only comes from death. This creates a profound psychological dissonance with the European view of the harvest. To the Pilgrims, the crop was a commodity, a blessing from God to be tallied, stored, and owned. It was property. To the Wampanoag, the crop was a relative. It was the physical manifestation of an ancestor who had bled for them. You do not waste a relative. You do not treat the body of the corn mother with casual indifference. Imagine the horror then from the indigenous perspective as they watched the settlers' manners at the table. The Europeans, unfamiliar with the spiritual weight of the food, likely ate with a voracious, careless energy. They discarded cobs, they let scraps fall to the dogs. They treated the sacred flesh of the three sisters as mere fuel. To the Wampanoag elders present, this wasn't just bad etiquette, it was a spiritual crime. It was a desecration of the sacrifice that allowed the crops to grow. They knew that the corn mother is a benevolent spirit, but she is also a mother. And a mother scorned does not simply weep, she retaliates. The lore suggests that if the three sisters are disrespected, they do not just stop growing, they turn. The corn becomes prone to black rot, a fungus that looks like scorched flesh. The beans wither into hard, stone-like pellets that break teeth. The squash rots from the inside out, looking healthy on the surface, but filled with gray sludge, the color of the pukwudgie. This is the blight, the physical manifestation of the corn mother's rage. The winter that followed the 1621 feast is often described by historians as a time of harsh weather and poor planning. But view it through the lens of this mythology. The starving time that decimated the colonies in the early years looks less like bad luck and more like a curse fulfilled. The Wampanoag would have seen the failing crops and the freezing deaths of the settlers not as random tragedies, but as the inevitable result of disrespecting the spirits of the land. The earth had closed its fist. The corn mother had withdrawn her body. The pukwudgies had moved in from the tree line, emboldened by the spiritual weakness of the intruders. There is a specific, chilling detail in the Wampanoag oral history regarding the sound of the winter wind. They say that when the harvest is disrespected, the wind changes its voice. It stops sounding like moving air and starts sounding like a woman crying. This is the voice of the corn mother, weeping for her wasted flesh. It is said that during the worst nights of the freeze, when the Pilgrims were huddled in their drafty cabins, praying to a god who seemed very far away, the Wampanoag could hear the crying in the wind. They knew that the crying wasn't just sorrow, it was a summons. It was summoning the entities that thrive where the corn fails. Because when the protective barrier of the three sisters is broken, when the gratitude is revealed to be hollow, the void is filled by something else, something ancient, hungry, and cold. This brings us to the precipice of the third legend, a story that is perhaps the most dangerous of all, because it deals not with the spirits of the earth or the forest, but with the corruption of the human soul itself. The Wampanoag understood that hunger is not just a physical sensation, it is a doorway. And if you are not careful, if you let the hunger hollow you out, you become susceptible to a transformation that is irreversible. The Pilgrims feared starvation because it meant death. The indigenous peoples feared it because it meant becoming a monster.
In the deep winter, when the stores are low and the wind is crying with the voice of the corn mother, the mind begins to fracture. The isolation of the New England winter is absolute. The darkness starts at 4 in the afternoon. The cold is a physical weight. In this environment, the barrier between man and beast dissolves.
The Algonquin peoples share a terrified whisper about the Chenoo, the ice giant, the creature that was once a man, but whose heart has turned to solid ice through greed and cannibalistic hunger. While the Wendigo is the more famous cousin of this legend among the northern tribes, the Wampanoag and their neighbors knew the Chenoo intimately. The legend states that a Chenoo is born when a human being commits the ultimate taboo, putting their own survival above the community, consuming the flesh of another to stay alive. But the transformation can also be subtle. It can begin with a hardness of heart. It can begin with hoarding. Consider the dynamics of the 1621 era. You have two populations living on the razor's edge of survival. The Pilgrims, terrified and hoarding their supplies, building fences, locking doors. To the Wampanoag, this behavior, this intense, selfish hoarding of resources mimicked the early symptoms of the Chenoo curse. A man who locks his food away while his neighbor starves is not just prudent, he is cooling his own heart. He is inviting the ice to enter his chest. The legend says that the Chenoo starts as a normal person, but as the greed takes hold, they begin to feel a burning heat inside them, a fever that the cold cannot touch. They strip off their clothes in the freezing snow. They bite their own lips until they bleed. They look at their family members and see not kin, but meat. The Wampanoag watched the settlers with a wary eye, looking for these signs. When a settler became irrational with fever or aggressive over rations, the Wampanoag didn't see a sick Englishman. They saw a Chenoo in the making. This fear shaped the interactions between the two groups in ways that standard history ignores. The Wampanoag generosity, the very generosity we celebrate at Thanksgiving, was partially a preventative measure. You give food freely not just to be kind, but to keep the ice from forming in your own heart. Generosity is the antidote to the Chinook. By feeding the Pilgrims, the Wampanoag were not just saving the settlers, they were saving themselves from the spiritual contagion of greed. They were keeping the community warm to prevent the monsters from being born. But the settlers did not understand this spiritual economy. They took the food and then they built higher fences. They accepted the charity and then demanded land. In the eyes of the myth keepers, the settlers were failing the test. They were displaying all the traits of a people whose hearts were slowly freezing over. And the tragedy of the Thanksgiving legend is that the Wampanoag realized too late that the ice was already in the blood of their guests. The horror of the Chenoo is that it cannot be reasoned with. Once the heart is frozen, the human is gone. All that remains is a hunger that can never be sated. And as the years went on, as the treaties were broken and the massacres began, the Wampanoag must have looked at the expanding colonies and realized with a sinking dread, we did not invite neighbors to the table. We invited the Chenoo. But there is a specific ritual to combat this, a way to melt the ice before it consumes the soul. It involves fire, but not the kind you cook with. It involves a story that must be told only when the snow is deep, a story that acts as a warning and a ward. This fire is not merely for warmth. It is a beacon against the encroaching dark. In the Wampanoag tradition, as in many indigenous cultures of the Northeast, certain stories are forbidden during the warm months. To speak of monsters while the earth is awake is to invite them. But when the frost hardens the ground and the sap retreats to the roots, the barriers between the spirit world and the physical world grow thin. The harvest feast, situated on the precipice of winter, was the moment when the protection of the sun began to fade, and the people had to rely on the protection of the pact. This brings us to the food itself, and the legend that sits at the very center of the table, often dismissed as a charming agricultural metaphor, but actually representing a sacred, blood-deep covenant, the legend of the three sisters. You know them as corn, beans, and squash. In the sanitized version of the Thanksgiving narrative, these are simply crops that the friendly Squanto taught the helpless pilgrims to grow. It is framed as a transfer of technology, a gardening tip passed from one culture to another. But in the mythology, the three sisters are not crops. They are living, sentient spirits, and their story is one of desperate survival and the terrifying consequences of separation. The legend tells of three sisters who could not exist apart. The eldest, Corn, stands tall and guards the others. But she has no feet to walk, and her ankles are weak in the wind. The middle sister, Bean, is fragile and cannot stand on her own. Yet she possesses the strength to bind and hold. The youngest, Squash, stays low to the ground, protecting the earth's moisture and warding off the weeds that would choke them all. Individually, they are vulnerable. The wind snaps the corn. The bean rots on the damp earth. The squash withers in the sun. But together, they form a fortress. The dark undertone of this legend, the part that is rarely whispered over a turkey dinner, is what happens when the sisters are disrespected. The mythology suggests that the sisters are not infinite resources. They are guests who can choose to leave. If you plant them in rows, separated and isolated, as the European settlers insisted on doing, imposing their geometry of dominance upon the soil, the sisters do not just die, they abandon the people. The famine that follows is not a biological accident. It is a spiritual rejection. When the Wampanoag shared the secret of the three sisters with the pilgrims, they were not just sharing food. They were inviting these strangers into a sacred triangle of existence. They were teaching them the fundamental law of the land. Survival requires a web of support. You cannot stand tall without something to hold on to, and you cannot flourish without protecting the ground beneath you. The settlers, however, viewed the land through the lens of extraction. They saw the yield, not the relationship. They took the seeds, but they did not take the lesson. This disconnect creates a haunting subtext to the Thanksgiving feast. While the Wampanoag were celebrating the successful union of the sisters, honoring the spirits that allowed them to survive another year, they were dining with men who would eventually tear the sisters apart. The introduction of European monoculture, planting vast fields of a single crop for profit, was, in the eyes of the mythos, a torture of the land spirits. It was a deliberate breaking of the family bond. The soil exhaustion and dust bows that would plague the continent centuries later can be traced back to this moment, the rejection of the three sisters' wisdom. The Wampanoag sat at that table knowing that if the pact with the earth is broken, the earth does not forgive. It simply stops giving. But the threats were not only in the soil. They were watching from the tree line. As the smoke from the 1621 feast drifted into the woods, it passed through the territory of a creature far more vindictive than the Chinoo and far more cunning than the spirits of the harvest. To understand the tension of that first Thanksgiving, you must understand the Pukwudgie. In Wampanoag folklore, the Pukwudgie are 2 to 3 foot tall beings, humanoid but distinctly other. They are the masters of the forest, The tricksters, the ones who were here before the humans and who will likely be here after. In modern retellings, they are sometimes likened to trolls or goblins, but this diminishes their terror. The Pukwudgie are ancient, magical, and profoundly jealous. The legend goes that the Pukwudgie were once friendly with the tribes, or at least indifferent. But they grew envious of the affection the people showed to Mashop, the giant creator figure of the Wampanoag. Mashop was beloved. He cleared the land, he guided the whales to shore, he taught the people how to live. The Pukwudgie, feeling ignored and slighted, turned their hearts to stone. They did not launch a war of armies, they launched a war of shadows. They are said to use poison arrows, to create balls of fire to lure travelers off the path, and to possess the ability to shapeshift into the dangerous porcupine. But their most chilling behavior is their tendency to kidnap souls. A person wandering too far from the firelight, or someone who disrespects the boundaries of the forest, might simply vanish. Or worse, they might return, but with their eyes empty, pushed off high cliffs, or led into the swamps to drown. The Pukwudgie represent the inherent hostility of the wilderness when the balance of respect is lost. They are the anti-neighbors. Now place this legend into the context of 1621. The Pilgrims were terrified of the American wilderness. To them, the woods were the devil's domain, a chaotic, godless place filled with unseen eyes. For the Wampanoag, the woods were indeed filled with eyes, but they knew exactly whose eyes they were. They knew that the Pukwudgie were watching the feast. The presence of 90 Wampanoag warriors at the celebration wasn't just a diplomatic show of force for the settlers. It was a spiritual perimeter. Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader Sachem, was navigating a landscape filled with both human enemies, like the Narragansett tribe to the west, and supernatural threats. By allying with the English, he was making a calculated gamble. He was bringing a new, unknown power into a land already teeming with ancient, jealous spirits. The tragedy is that the Pukwudgie's turn from friend to foe mirrors the trajectory of the settlers themselves. The Pukwudgie myth serves as a premonition. It tells the story of a relationship that sours because of jealousy and a lack of reciprocity. The Pukwudgies turned on the Wampanoag because they felt the people had chosen a new protector in Mashop. Similarly, the settlers would eventually turn on the Wampanoag when they no longer needed their protection. First Thanksgiving sits in that brief, fragile window before the jealousy took hold, a moment of calm before the Pukwudgies, literal and metaphorical, began their work. There is a particularly dark intersection here involving Mashop. In some versions of the lore, Mashop eventually leaves the Wampanoag. Some say he went to sleep. Others say he was driven away by the arrival of the white birds, the sailing ships of the Europeans. With Mashop gone, the check on the Pukwudgies was removed. The tricksters were free to torment the people without fear of the giants' retribution. So, when we look back at the table in 1621, we have to realize that the Wampanoag were a people who believed their greatest protector might be fading, while the spirits of the woods were growing bolder. They were looking for stability in a world that was spiritually unraveling. The English muskets were loud, yes, but could a musket kill a Pukwudgie? Could a treaty stop the Chenoo? The feast was an attempt to build a new structure of safety, but the foundation was flawed because the guests did not know the rules of the house. The settlers ate the corn, but did not honor the sisters. They walked the woods, but did not fear the Pukwudgie. Ignorance is often treated as innocence in history books, but in folklore, ignorance is a death sentence. To enter a haunted house without believing in ghosts does not protect you from them. It simply makes you easier prey. The atmosphere of that 3-day celebration was likely thick with this unspoken dread. While the Pilgrims fired their guns in displays of martial prowess, the Wampanoag were likely listening to the echoes, wondering if the noise would scare away the game or attract something worse. They were operating on a frequency of reality that the settlers were completely deaf to. And this deafness extended to the very concept of the gift. In the European mind, a gift is a transaction or a charity. In the indigenous worldview, particularly in the potlatch cultures and their Eastern equivalents, a gift is a burden. It creates a debt. It binds the receiver to the giver. By accepting the food, the land, and the knowledge of the Wampanoag, the settlers were entering into a spiritual debt of massive proportions. The legends warn that debts to the spirit world must be paid, one way or another. If not in gratitude, then in blood. The Wampanoag brought 5 deer to the feast. This is a detail often cited to prove their generosity. But consider the deer in the context of the Great Spirit and the balance of the hunt. Taking life requires gratitude. If the consumers of that life do not offer the proper thanks, not just words, but a way of living that honors the sacrifice, the spirit of the animal is offended. The settlers ate the deer, but they did not inherit the stewardship of the forest. They consumed the physical sustenance while starving the spiritual connection. This creates a fascinating, terrifying duality to the Thanksgiving image. On one side of the table, you have a people trying to integrate new neighbors into a cosmic system of balance. On the other side, you have a people who view the world as a storehouse of commodities to be unlocked. It is a collision of mythologies. The Wampanoag were living out a story of interdependence, where the 3 sisters and the Pukwudgies and the Chinooks define the boundaries of behavior. The settlers were living out a story of conquest, where the wilderness is an enemy to be subdued. The friction between these 2 stories would eventually spark a fire that burned the continent. But before the war, there was the silence of the winter that followed, the silence of the Pukwudgie watching from the tree line, waiting for the first broken promise. The legends tell us that the spirits are patient. They do not strike when the belly is full. They strike when the memory fades. And as the years passed, the memory of the pact made at that table faded from the minds of the settlers with alarming speed. The Wampanoag, however, remembered. They remembered because their stories wouldn't let them forget. The oral tradition is a chain that links the past to the present, and every winter when the fires were lit, they would retell the stories of the Chinooks and the Pukwudgie, refining the warnings, realizing that the old monsters had taken on new, pale faces. This leads us to a legend that is perhaps the most tragic of all, because it speaks not of monsters that come from the outside, but of a darkness that rises from the water itself. A legend that explains why the very arrival of the ships was seen by some not as a discovery, but as a return of something ancient and terrible. It concerns the giant Malshop, whom we touched upon, and the prophecy of the Great Canoe. But to understand the gravity of this, we must look at the water. To the Wampanoag, the ocean was the realm of the Mishipishu, the great water panther, and the place where the world ends. The settlers arrived from the direction of death. In many indigenous cosmologies, the east, across the great water, is the direction of the afterlife, or the source of powerful, chaotic winds. For people to arrive from the sunrise was confusing. For them to arrive in floating islands with clouds for wings, the sails, was cataclysmic. This perspective shifts the narrative from a story of exploration to one of cosmic horror. To the indigenous priests, the powwows, the arrival of these ships wasn't just an intrusion. It was a rupture in the spiritual fabric of the world. The ocean was a barrier, a chaotic expanse that separated the living from the unknown. And for beings to traverse it meant they possessed a power that defied the natural order. It wasn't merely that strangers had arrived. It was that the rules of reality had been broken. This dread was compounded by a specific, haunting prophecy attributed to Malshop, the giant protector of the Wampanoag. Oral traditions tell us that long before the Mayflower dropped anchor, Malshop had a vision. He stood upon the cliffs of Gay Head on Martha's Vineyard, looking out over the water he had so often waded through to catch whales. But this time, the water brought no sustenance. He saw a great white bird rising from the sea, a bird that would take the land and never leave. In some versions of the legend, Mashop tried to warn his people, but seeing the inevitability of the tide, he made a choice that resonates with profound sorrow. He did not fight. He realized that his time, the time of giants and direct intervention, was ending. He turned his wife into stone to spare her the coming grief, and he slipped into the water, vanishing forever, leaving his people to face the white bird alone. When the sails of the European ships appeared on the horizon, they looked terrifyingly like the wings of that prophesied bird. The giant had fled. The protectors were gone. The arrival was not a beginning, but the fulfillment of an ending. But the horror was not just in what arrived, but in what had immediately preceded it. We cannot talk about the mythology of Thanksgiving without addressing the apocalypse that paved the way for it. This is the part of the legend that is often sanitized into sickness, but in the folklore of the time, it was viewed as a spiritual scourging. Between 1616 and 1619, just a year before the Pilgrims landed, a mysterious plague swept through the coastal tribes. We know now it was likely leptospirosis, or viral hepatitis, introduced by earlier European traders. But to the Wampanoag, this was the Great Dying. It is difficult for us to comprehend the scale of this devastation. It wasn't a tragedy, it was an extinction event. In the span of 3 years, 90% of the population along the coast was wiped out. Entire villages were silenced. The smoke from hearth fires ceased to rise. The cornfields, usually tended with sacred precision, grew wild and rotted on the stalk. The dead outnumbered the living to such a degree that the social fabric completely disintegrated. There were no hands left to bury the bodies. When the Pilgrims arrived, they didn't find a pristine wilderness waiting to be tamed. They stepped into a graveyard. They found villages that were standing perfectly intact but entirely empty, save for the bleaching bones of those who had died too quickly to be interred. This is where the historical record and dark folklore merge into a macabre reality. The Pilgrims, in their religious fervor, viewed this desolation not as a tragedy, but as a divine miracle. They wrote in their journals that God had cleared the land for them, sweeping away the savages to make room for His chosen people. But from the indigenous perspective, this wasn't God, it was sorcery. The timing was too precise. First came the floating islands, then came the invisible fire that burned the people from the inside out, and finally, the pale strangers arrived to occupy the empty houses of the dead. It reinforced the terrifying idea that these newcomers wielded a dark, necromantic power. They walked among the unburied dead without fear, untouched by the plague that had devoured the warriors of the coast. To a people whose worldview was deeply rooted in the balance of spirits, the immunity of the settlers was proof of their supernatural malevolence. This tension came to a head in an incident that is rarely depicted in the festive recountings of the holiday. Shortly after their arrival, the starving pilgrims, desperate for supplies, stumbled upon mounds of earth in the abandoned regions. They began to dig. They found baskets of corn, which they took. But in other mounds, they found things that should have terrified them: human remains, red ochre, and personal possessions meant for the afterlife. In the Wampanoag tradition, disturbing a grave is not just a disrespect, it is a dangerous provocation of the spirit world. It invites retribution. Yet, these strangers dug up the ancestors, stole the offerings, and suffered no immediate lightning strike. This deepened the mythological fear. What kind of entities were these who could loot the underworld and eat the food of the dead? This atmosphere of supernatural dread is essential to understanding the figure of Tisquantum, Squanto. In the sanitized legend, he is the friendly helper who emerges from the woods to teach the settlers how to plant corn. But in the context of the Great Dying, Tisquantum is a tragic, ghostly figure. He had been kidnapped years earlier, sold into slavery in Spain, and had miraculously made his way back home across the ocean, a journey that was, in itself, mythical. But when he returned, he found his home, Patuxet, gone. Every single person he knew was dead. The village was a mass grave. He was a man walking through the ruins of his own life. When he walked into the pilgrim camp, he wasn't just a diplomat. He was a survivor of the apocalypse, allying himself with the very forces that seemed to have caused it. And here lies one of the darkest pieces of folklore associated with him. The Wampanoag sachem Massasoit did not trust Tisquantum. He viewed him with suspicion, a man who had lived too long in the direction of death across the sea. There are oral histories and even colonial reports suggesting that Tisquantum used the settlers' reputation for sorcery to build his own power. He reportedly told the neighboring tribes that the English kept the plague in barrels buried under their storehouses, and that at his command, they could release it again to destroy anyone who opposed him. This is a manipulation of mythology that is chilling in its brilliance. Tisquantum took the very real biological horror that had decimated his people and reframed it as a weapon of magical warfare, placing his hand on the trigger. He became the gatekeeper of the apocalypse. The first Thanksgiving was not a gathering of friends. It was a tense political summit held in the shadow of these plague barrels. The Wampanoag were there not just out of charity, but out of a desperate need to ally with the sorcerers who held the power of the Great Dying, hoping to direct that power against their traditional enemies, the Narragansett, who had been spared the plague and were now threatening to overrun the weakened Wampanoag. The feast was eaten on land that was literally fertilized by the bodies of the Patuxet people. The joy and gratitude we ascribe to that day were a thin veneer over a landscape of profound trauma and fear. The legends of the time didn't speak of a new beginning. They spoke of a world that had been turned upside down, where the dead lay unburied, giants had fled into the sea, and the new masters of the land claimed to keep death itself locked in wooden casks beneath the earth. This manipulation of fear, this weaponization of the invisible fire, leads us deeper into the psychology of the time. It suggests that the Wampanoag and other coastal tribes were forced to integrate these newcomers into their mythos not as guests, but as monsters that had to be appeased. And as the settlements grew, the nature of that monster began to shift. It wasn't just about disease anymore. A new hunger was revealing itself. A hunger that consumed land, resources, and spirit with an appetite that could never be sated. This brings us to a legend that, while more prevalent among the Algonquian-speaking peoples to the north, began to bleed southward in concept as the colonization expanded. It is the legend of the ultimate consumer, the embodiment of greed and starvation that grows stronger the more it eats. As the settlers pushed further inland, ignoring treaties and consuming the forests, the indigenous people began to see the manifestation of a different kind of evil, one that looked human but possessed a heart of ice. This was the shadow of the Wendigo. While the Wendigo is traditionally associated with winter starvation and cannibalism, its metaphorical weight began to settle heavily on the colonial expansion. The settlers were behaving like entities possessed by this spirit, consuming without nourishment, taking without giving back, driven by an insatiable void. The Thanksgiving table, piled high with food in the midst of a land stripped of its people, becomes a grotesque mirror of this legend. It wasn't just a celebration of harvest. It was the first feast of a consuming force that would eventually swallow the continent. The transition from the specific Wampanoag fear of the Great Canoe and the plague barrels to the broader continental dread of this consuming hunger marks the shift from the initial shock of contact to the long, grinding horror of colonization. The monsters were no longer just coming from the sea. They were now rooting themselves in the soil, transforming the land into something unrecognizable. And the most terrifying realization for the indigenous storytellers was that this hunger was contagious. It wasn't just that the settlers were greedy. It was that their presence seemed to infect the world around them, turning balance into extraction. As we peel back these layers, we see that the legends were trying to warn us. They were encoding the trauma of history into monsters so that future generations would understand the nature of the threat. Maushop didn't just leave. He made room for a new era, one where the monsters didn't look like giant birds or water panthers, but like men in black coats holding Bibles and muskets. But there is one final layer to this mythological history, a legend that is often whispered but rarely analyzed in the context of this holiday. It concerns the corn itself, the very staple of the Thanksgiving meal. In the indigenous tradition, corn is often a mother spirit, a giver of life. But there are darker stories about what happens when the corn mother is abused, when the gift is taken by those who do not know the songs of gratitude. These stories suggest that the land itself has a memory, and that the harvest gathered by unholy hands carries a curse of its own, a slow poison that affects the soul of the consumer. The Wampanoag saw the English eating the corn that had been stolen from the graves, eating the food of the dead. In their eyes, this act sealed the settlers' fate, binding them to a cycle of violence and unrest that would plague their nation for centuries. They believed you become what you consume, and if you consume the stolen offerings of the dead, you become a ghost in your own life, forever haunting a land that will never truly accept you. This concept of spiritual trespass brings us to a legend that is far more tangible and far more malicious than a simple curse. While the Corn Mother represents the benevolent, nurturing aspect of the earth, Wampanoag folklore is equally populated by entities that represent the land's capacity for rejection, creatures that actively despise human encroachment. To understand the true psychological landscape of that first Thanksgiving, you must understand what was watching them from the tree line. You must understand the Pukwudgie. In the modern imagination, we might hear forest spirit and picture something whimsical, a fairy tale creature of mischief. But in the Algonquian tradition, and specifically within the Wampanoag lore that dominated the Plymouth region, the Pukwudgie is a figure of genuine dread. Standing 2 to 3 feet tall, with smooth gray skin that blends seamlessly into the granite and bark of the New England woods, they are said to possess features that resemble a human's, but distorted. Enlarged noses, fingers that are too long, and eyes that glow with a pale, cold luminescence. They are shapeshifters, capable of appearing as a porcupine or a ball of light to lure the unwary into the swamps. And unlike the spirits that demand respect or ritual, the Pukwudgies eventually grew to demand only blood. The legend tells us that these beings were once friendly to the Wampanoag, or at least indifferent. But as the people grew in number and confidence, the Pukwudgies became jealous of the affection showed to the humans by Maushop, the giant creator figure of Wampanoag mythology. This jealousy festered into a deep ancestral hatred. They began to play tricks that turned fatal, pushing fishermen off cliffs, stealing children from the edge of the camp, and shooting unsuspecting hunters with arrows that left no wound but instilled a sickness that no medicine man could cure. Maushop eventually gathered the Pukwudgies and scattered them across the lands, casting many of them away to distant regions. But they crawled back. They always crawl back. And when Maushop eventually departed, some say he left in sorrow, others say he was driven away by the coming of the whites. The Wampanoag were left alone with these little gray tyrants of the forest. When the Pilgrims arrived, they brought with them a profound fear of the howling wilderness. Their diaries are filled with references to the devil lurking behind every tree, of strange voices in the wind, and of an oppressive, watchful presence in the woods. We often interpret this through a secular lens as simple agoraphobia or the fear of the unknown, but look at it through the lens of the Wampanoag legend. The Pilgrims had built their settlement on top of a graveyard, in a land infested with hostile spirits that the indigenous people themselves struggled to keep at bay. The settlers reported seeing demons and goblins in the twilight. It is entirely possible that what they were experiencing was the psychological pressure of a land that the folklore insisted was alive with malice. The Wampanoag knew that the woods surrounding the Plymouth plantation were not empty. They were the domain of the Pukwudgie. When Massasoit and his 90 warriors arrived for that 3-day feast, they weren't just stepping into a diplomatic meeting with the English. They were stepping into a buffer zone. By allying with the English, they were effectively placing a new, unsuspecting enemy between themselves and the deep wilderness. There is a dark strategic brilliance to this. If the Pukwudgies, or the energies they represented, hated human expansion, let them focus their malice on these strange, pale newcomers who stomped loudly through the forest and had no knowledge of the protective rituals. This adds a layer of spectral tension to the Thanksgiving table. While the English were thanking their God for survival, the Wampanoag were acutely aware that they were eating in a haunted place. The peace of that first Thanksgiving was a fragile bubble surrounded by a spiritual war zone. Every snap of a twig in the surrounding darkness wasn't just a deer. In the minds of the Wampanoag, it was likely a Pukwudgie waiting for a straggler to wander too far from the firelight. The legend suggests that the land does not belong to us. We are guests, and often we are unwanted guests. The Pukwudgie serves as the violent enforcer of this truth, a reminder that if you disrespect the balance, the woods themselves will conspire to remove you. But the Pukwudgie is a danger from the outside. There is another legend, darker still, that speaks of a danger from within. A legend that reshapes our understanding of the settler's character and the ultimate fate of the alliance. This is the legend of the Chenoo, or the Ice Heart, a myth prevalent among the northern Algonquian peoples, including the neighbors of the Wampanoag. It is the story of the cannibal giant, the being that has consumed human flesh until it transforms into a monster of insatiable greed. While the specific term Wendigo is more commonly associated with the Ojibwe and Cree further north and west, the concept of the consumer spirit is universal across the region. The Chenoo was once a human who succumbed to selfishness and gluttony, their heart turning to solid ice. The more they ate, the hungrier they became. They would swell in size, their lips tattered and bloody, constantly seeking to devour everything around them, resources, animals, people. They were the embodiment of consumption without gratitude, of taking without giving back. As the Wampanoag watched the colony expand in the years following 1621, they began to see the manifestation of this spirit. The settlers were not like the tribes, who moved with the seasons and let the land rest. The settlers built fences. They clear-cut forests. They claimed ownership over things that could not be owned. They consumed the land with a hunger that seemed to have no bottom. In the indigenous mythological framework, this behavior was not just cultural difference. It was a symptom of a spiritual sickness. It was the pathology of the Chenoo. The legend warns that this hunger is contagious. It is a spirit virus. When you interact with a Chenoo, when you feed it or try to reason with it, you risk being infected by its greed. The first encounter and the subsequent alliance can be viewed as the Wampanoag attempting to tame a beast that could not be sated. They brought deer and corn to the Thanksgiving table, offering sustenance to these starving strangers, hoping that a full belly would bring peace. But the mythology of the ice heart teaches that a full belly only strengthens the monster for the next hunt. By feeding the pilgrims, by saving them from that first brutal winter, the Wampanoag may have inadvertently strengthened the very force that would eventually consume them. The tragedy of Thanksgiving, when viewed through this legend, is the tragedy of the enabler. They treated the settlers as humans who needed help, failing to recognize, until it was too late, that they were dealing with a civilization possessed by the spirit of the Chinoo. The settlers' expansion was not driven by need, but by a compulsion to accumulate, to devour, to turn the living world into dead capital. This recontextualizes the feast entirely. It wasn't a celebration of mutual survival. It was the moment the Wampanoag fared the ice heart. And as the decades passed, and the fences grew higher, and the treaties were broken one by one, the elders would look back at that harvest festival not with nostalgia, but with the bitter realization of the legend's truth. You cannot satiate a hunger that is born of the soul's emptiness. The horror of this realization leads us directly into the most prophetic and devastating of the legends, the vision of the white bird and the end of the world cycle. This is not merely a story of monsters or ghosts, but a story of time itself and the inevitability of collapse. The Wampanoag and their neighbors lived in a cyclical time where worlds are created, destroyed, and reborn. They knew that their world was old. They knew that signs were appearing in the sky and on the earth that signaled a great unraveling. The arrival of the Mayflower was not a random event. In the deep mythology of the Atlantic Coast tribes, there were prophecies of a great white bird rising from the ocean, bringing with it people who would change the face of the earth forever. But unlike the messianic prophecies of other cultures, this was not a promise of salvation. It was a warning of erasure. The white bird was the harbinger of a new epoch, one where the connection between man and nature would be severed. When the pilgrim ship was first spotted on the horizon with its massive white sails unfurled, catching the wind like the wings of a giant avian predator, it sent a shockwave through the spiritual leadership of the tribes. This was the materialization of the nightmare. The shamans and medicine men, the powwows, would have recognized the imagery immediately. The great bird had arrived, and it had brought the people of the stone, men with hearts as hard as rock, who could not hear the songs of the earth. This prophecy suggests that the Wampanoag leadership, particularly Massasoit, were navigating a scenario that was already written in the stars. Their actions, the caution, the initial distance, the eventual alliance, were all attempts to manage an apocalypse that had been foretold. They weren't just engaging in politics, they were trying to survive the turning of the cosmic wheel. The Thanksgiving feast, therefore, was a desperate ritual, a final attempt to weave these new, destructive threads into the fabric of their world before the pattern unraveled completely. But the threads would not hold. The fabric was already tearing. The legend of the white bird implies that the destruction was inevitable, that the settlers were merely the agents of a necessary, albeit painful, purification of the land. It suggests that the violence that followed, the King Philip's War, the massacres, the displacement, was the result of two incompatible realities colliding, one based on the circle, eternal and renewing, and one based on the line, marching forward, consuming everything in its path until it reaches the edge of the cliff. As we peel back these layers, the image of the happy pilgrims and the welcoming Indians dissolves completely. What replaces it is a tableau of immense tension, a people trying to appease a prophesied doom, sharing a meal with entities they suspected were spiritually hollow, while the tricksters of the forest watched from the shadows, sharpening their arrows. It creates a picture of a world on the brink, holding its breath, waiting for the first drop of blood to shatter the truce. And as we know, the blood would come. It would come in rivers. But there is one final element to this mythology, a legend that speaks not of the past, but of the future. It is a story that is rarely told outside of the community, a story about what lies buried beneath the soil of Plymouth, waiting to return. It is the legend of the sleeping sachem and the return of the stolen harvest. This is where the story moves from history into the realm of active, living magic. Because according to the lore, the story of Thanksgiving isn't over. The debt has not been paid, and the spirits that were awakened in 1621 have not gone back to sleep. The soil of New England has a memory. In the folklore of the Wampanoag and the Narragansett, the earth is not merely a platform upon which history plays out. It is a living archive, a skin that covers a breathing, conscious entity. And deep within that skin, beneath the asphalt of modern Plymouth, beneath the manicured lawns and the tourist centers selling pilgrim hats, lies the legend of the sleeping sachem. This is not a story you will find in the sanitized textbooks that frame the harvest feast as the birth of a nation. It is a story whispered in the longhouses during the freezing moons, a story that reframes the entire colonial experiment not as a conquest, but as a temporary intrusion upon a sleeping giant. The legend speaks of a leader, sometimes identified as a spiritual reflection of Massasoit himself, or perhaps a composite of the great sachems who followed, who did not truly die, but instead entered a state of suspended animation deep within the roots of the sacred pines. The lore suggests that when the Treaty of 1621 was forged, it was not just a political agreement between two desperate groups of men. It was a binding spiritual covenant, witnessed by the sun, the moon, and the spirits of the forest. The Wampanoag brought the harvest, the knowledge of the Corn Mother, and the protection of their warriors. In exchange, the settlers offered friendship and mutual defense. But as we know, the settler side of the bargain was broken, shattered by the expansionist hunger that followed the initial years of peace. However, in the logic of dark mythology, a broken covenant does not simply dissolve, it festers. The sleeping sachem is said to be the guardian of this broken contract. He rests in the earth, holding the seed of the true harvest in his skeletal hand. This seed represents the vitality of the land, the abundance that was gifted to the strangers from the sea. The legend warns that as long as the debt of blood and betrayal remains unpaid, the land will slowly turn against those who occupy it. It is a slow burn curse, a subtle poisoning of the well. It suggests that the erratic weather, the sudden blights, and the inexplicable misfortunes that have plagued the region over centuries are not random. They are the stirring of the sachem, the land tossing and turning in a fever dream, rejecting the presence of those who violated the sacred laws of hospitality. This brings a terrifying new dimension to the Thanksgiving table. When we sit down to feast, the folklore implies we are reenacting a ritual that went wrong. We are eating the food of a harvest that was essentially stolen, consuming the bounty of a land that is technically under a spiritual embargo. The Pukwajis we spoke of earlier, those chaotic tricksters of the forest, are merely the foot soldiers of this rejection. They are the symptoms of a land that has lost its masters. The sleeping sachem is the source. He waits for the moment when the weight of the betrayal becomes too heavy for the earth to bear, at which point the stolen harvest will turn to ash in the mouths of the ungrateful. There is a profound melancholy to this final legend. It transforms the landscape of Massachusetts from a quaint historical backdrop into a haunted graveyard. It suggests that the spirits of King Philip's War, the brutal conflict that followed the generation of the first Thanksgiving, never truly left. They merely retreated into the shadows, into the swamps where the English feared to tread, waiting for the cycle of time to turn. The Wampanoag people today still gather on Coles Hill in Plymouth every Thanksgiving, not to celebrate, but to observe a national day of mourning. While the rest of the country watches parades and football, they stand in solemn silence above the rock. In the context of the folklore, this is not just a protest, it is a containment ritual. Their drumming and their chanting are what keep the angry spirits at bay, soothing the sleeping sachem, telling the earth that there are still those who remember, still those who honor the old ways. Without this vigilance, the mythology suggests the consequences would be dire. The Thanksgiving curse is a concept found in the deeper, darker corners of indigenous oral tradition. The idea that a society built on the bones of a betrayed host can never truly be at peace. It creates a civilization that is perpetually hungry, perpetually anxious, always consuming but never satisfied, because the food it eats lacks the blessing of the corn mother. The spirit of the corn, offended by the slaughter of her children, withdrew her true nourishment, leaving behind only empty calories and a hunger that drives the consumer to devour more and more, yet remain spiritually starving. This connects back to the figure of Hobomok, the dark deity we discussed at the beginning. If the settlers allied themselves with a force of death and destruction, then the society that sprang from that alliance is inextricably linked to his shadow. The Thanksgiving feast, in this light, is a tribute to survival at any cost, a celebration of a deal made with the darkness. The turkey, the cranberry, the squash, these are not just ingredients. They are artifacts of a survival horror story where the protagonist survived by making a pact with entities they did not understand, triggering a curse that has rippled through 400 years of history. So, where does this leave us? We have peeled back the layers of the Thanksgiving myth to reveal a landscape populated by giants who turned into whales, tricksters who lure men to their deaths with glowing lights, a corn mother whose body became the crops, and a skeletal guardian waiting beneath the soil for justice. The holiday is no longer a simple story of pilgrims and Indians sharing a meal. It is a complex tapestry of collision, the collision of two worlds, two spiritualities, and two histories. One world was driven by written words and gunpowder. The other was woven from dreams, blood, and the magic of the earth. When the two collided, they didn't just create a nation, they created a mythology, a dark, winding mythology that is still being written today. The legends tell us that the land remembers everything. It remembers the sound of the muskets, the taste of the strange diseases, and the smoke of the burning villages. But it also remembers the generosity. It remembers the moment the Wampanoag looked at a starving, desperate people and chose to offer them bread instead of arrows. That choice, that singular moment of grace, is the tragedy and the beauty at the heart of the legend. It was a grace that was betrayed, yes, but its existence proves the spiritual superiority of those who offered it. As the sun sets on our investigation into these ancient tales, the woods of New England seem to grow darker, the shadows stretching long and thin like the fingers of a pukwudgie. The wind rattling the dry leaves sounds suspiciously like a whisper. The Thanksgiving table remains set, but the guests have changed. The ghosts of 1621 are standing behind the chairs, watching. The next time you see the stylized images of the first Thanksgiving, look closer. Look past the buckled hats and the smiles. Look for the shadows in the periphery. Look for mouth-shop smoke on the horizon. Listen for the laughter of the tricksters in the trees. And remember the sleeping sachem beneath your feet. The legends are not dead. They are merely waiting. The harvest is in, the table is spread, and the spirits are hungry. The story of Thanksgiving isn't just history. It is a living, breathing ghost story, and we are all haunting it together.